Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's podcast. My name is Ashley Stewart, and this is Awareness with Ashley. Every week, I pick a quote and I talk about how it relates to chronic illness. This week's episode, I'm going to be talking about emotional repression pretty much. Before I get into any of today's video, just a couple of announcements. So this will actually be the final podcast of 2023. I should be back the Thursday after New Year's, and usually I actually take a break with content completely during the Christmas and New Year's season. I haven't quite decided whether I'm gonna do that again because I just got back from a decent break already from being on retreat. So I haven't decided whether I'm actually going to do that this year. If I do, it'll be pretty much only short videos anyways because I don't plan on doing any podcast episodes during that time. The other thing that you guys might notice is that there's a few extra videos being released, and that is because there are some times where longer clips don't fit into the minute requirement for YouTube Shorts. So in that case, I'm actually putting it out as a clip that's still technically from the podcast, so I'm still only considering it a short video. There's still gonna be like short videos. They'll probably be like under 3 minutes, but it'll like highlight an important thing that I can't edit down into less than a minute for these shorts. So that's what those are. They're kind of like a clips. So they'll be actually eventually in their own playlist as well. I wanted to be able to include some of those longer things because it includes some pretty important topics sometimes, and they get left out at sometimes just because I have to be able to make it a minute long. In this latest podcast that I made into shorts, I had enough for a couple of weeks because I'm only going to release them a couple times every week probably, just to not overwhelm you guys with content. But I don't know whether there'll always be some of these or not. I don't think I really have anything else that I need to mention. I am starting to post a little bit more on Threads and on Instagram these days, kind of more behind the scenes and just my thoughts in the moment. And I say on Instagram as well because I often share the threads that I post to my Instagram story. So if you guys want some extra stuff, pop over to Instagram and see what's up there. But yeah, I think I'm ready to get into today's topic. So the quote today actually is, "Crying is how your body can speak when your mouth cannot form the words." And this is actually by an unknown author. I was scrolling through some quotes and found this one and thought it was a perfect topic to bring up with this because it applies so much to everything that is going on in my life right now, between this shift in identity, with awakening, with the emotional repression that happens with chronic illness, with just life in general. Basically, this is a perfect quote. Sometimes there are no words to properly express what is going on in a particular moment. Tears also welcome comfort from those closest to us too. We often want to push away this emotion, but crying for me contains the best opportunity to let emotions out. Even with that said, I've been known to repress this myself quite often, especially when surrounded by people I don't fully trust too. So I'm going to get into each section of this as we go along with this video and podcast. Crying and letting emotions out often communicates on a different level than where words fail to be able to even touch it. When I think, especially with primates and our ability for empathy, we tend to be either very uncomfortable around people who are upset, and I think there's a lot of conditioning and emotional repression that we see in others when we see this ourselves. For those of us who are very sensitive to that and have been through a lot, it actually makes us want to go and comfort that person and let them know everything is okay. And what's interesting actually is that this crying, and something you learn from retreat especially, is that you don't always have to go up to someone and comfort them. Like, what's behind that reason for wanting to go and comfort them? Sometimes it's just fine to let somebody experience uncomfortable emotions and not have to feel like you need to find a way to get them to feel better. That's kind of what I want to focus on when it comes to today. I want to talk about also the reasons why this comes up, because people honestly don't really notice, or I don't think people really understand exactly everything about why this becomes such a huge part of life with chronic illness. And so I'm hoping that this can shed some light on that. Crying comes in all forms when on the journey with chronic illness. Many might guess that there's a physical reason due to the pain, but honestly, there's a mental and emotional reasons for this release as well. Grief is a big reason that is not well known, as there's often a loss of identity with chronic illness as you grieve the things you could once do before you were sick. I have whole videos on this topic, so do take the time to actually check those out. Even if someone else who's been diagnosed with a chronic illness seems to have gone through a lot more of this loss, the loss is loss, and it all hurts quite a bit. So an example I want to give for this actually is, let's say you're comparing someone who's an athlete to somebody who's not. So let's say someone was training for the Olympics or something, and they ended up getting a pretty serious illness while doing that. People would probably relate to that, as that's a huge loss and change of identity to go from being extremely athletic, being able to do so much physically, and having this whole set out future about being at the next Olympics. But what people don't understand is that yes, that's a huge loss, but that's not a reason why somebody who has basically just had their whole future of what they wanted to do, let's say that they were planning on being some type of technician or something, or they were very, very satisfied in a job that they had, and all of a sudden they got sick to the point where they couldn't work anymore. That whole situation of your identity completely gets flipped on its head. People tend to understand the athlete better than they understand people who are very, very satisfied and are happy in the life that they have, and just all of a sudden it gets flipped on its head. This is actually a similar thing to what can happen with the shift in identity with awakening, and it's why you go through so much pain during this process, or one of the reasons. There's emotional repression and all of that I won't get into, but this is a big reason for that. And this grief that happens with this change is huge. You go through a whole grieving process. Like, it's a grieving process. You go through all the stages, hopefully to reach acceptance at some point. But this doesn't end, though, when you've accepted it, as flares often do cause a repeat of the grieving process. I think I've actually talked about this grieving process with chronic illness. Feel free to go and check that video out. It probably will be quite old because I did it quite early on, and I was probably going through some of that at the time, as that's often when it comes to mind. But I want people to understand that there's a massive grieving process with being diagnosed with these chronic illnesses. It's a grieving process, and it's a massive loss no matter what is going on, just with how fast things are happening and all of that. It's really, really hard to explain the impact of it, actually. Emotional loss includes frustration too. Many of us just want someone who will take the time to listen, and not feeling heard or having people in our lives telling us we're faking it for attention can lead to a lot of frustration and immense emotional pain. This can happen in the form of family, the endless doctor's appointments, friends who don't really include us anymore, not being able to keep a job or do the activities we used to enjoy. The list could go on for a while. You may also not realize that your actions are communicating to someone else that you feel they're faking it. Some people are extremely direct with this point and will point it out directly, but sometimes behaviors can imply this as well. So I put out the example of family no longer talking to you, or friends no longer asking if you want to spend time together. This is often where the isolation with chronic illness starts as well, which I have talked about quite a bit, because the whole idea is to raise awareness so that this stops happening. I don't know if it'll ever stop happening, but this isolation, if we can kind of narrow this window between people who have a chronic illness and not, if we can both reach an understanding, it makes every relationship better. And like, people are different too. So my biggest thing is that the people who have the chronic illness need to communicate what they're comfortable with and how they want to have life communicated about this, or things communicated about this, essentially. And then people who know someone with a chronic illness have to kind of find a way, if they're not being open, to feel into what they're comfortable with. And that can be harder if you're trying to really basically be compassionate with someone and they're kind of closed off. But we also got to realize that because there is a grieving process with this whole thing, that different people grieve very differently. So some people are going to want to isolate themselves as they go through everything and may not be fully open to sharing emotions. It's often underlying conditioning that leads to that. Others may be seeking quite a bit of comfort and contact, as that's the way they deal with grief. It's going to be very individual on the way you want to handle this. So I try and cover this in all different angles and talk about why it happens so that people can kind of get underneath the surface, basically. As I said, many people just want to find someone who will take the time to listen. We may not be seeking advice when we're spilling everything that is on our minds to you. And we may just be looking for that someone who's willing to listen without judgment and be there through the process. It doesn't always have to come with advice. I know a lot of people feel like they need to offer advice because they want to feel like they're helping, but that's when, at least I particularly tend to become more inward, is the fear of unsolicited advice, the amount of unsolicited advice that you receive from people meaning well and not meaning well is quite a lot. And it's just nice when you find that person who's willing to listen to you vent and then just sit there and listen and not have the desire to offer advice. It's not helpful. It's not helpful. If we are looking for advice, I know for me, I'll ask a direct question on how I can manage something. Now, I like being direct as it is, so that's probably why I do that. A lot of people, if they're looking for advice, will be asking you a particular question about how they can manage a situation. And there's a difference between venting out frustrations and wanting advice. And I know it's really hard to tell in the moment what that person might be wanting if they're not someone that you know well. But I would say offer that listening ear, and if the person goes, well, what should I do, then you kind of have an arrow in there. It sucks when you are not wanting advice and then you start getting it from all different angles, especially when you are dealing with these more rare conditions, because probably unless you're fairly newly symptomatic, you've tried everything at that point that you can think of. You might not think that there would be a huge loss with a chronic illness diagnosis, but there is. It feels like everything changes extremely fast, with little time to wrap your head around the situation you now find yourself in. Even in my case, where I got sick and took a while to get answers, that change from being healthy to being sick, it was essentially overnight. This massive loss and the things changing extremely quickly makes it so that you become frustrated really, really fast. Your mind doesn't really, and your body doesn't really know how to handle the emotions. Like, so much is changing so quickly that it's really, really hard for me to actually describe this into words. But the only way I can really express this is even when it takes a while to find out why you might be having the symptoms that you are, these changes have essentially happened almost instantly. And because of that, it's a lot to take in all at once. I honestly used to cry myself to sleep when I was the most sick. It wasn't always because of the pain exclusively, but because of the emotional exhaustion and grief that come along with this. Up until recently, and now that my preventative works really well, there was a lot of questioning whether I'd ever get back to even a bit of what society considers to be a normal life. Throughout this shadow and emotion work that I've had to face with this shift in identity, it's definitely come up again too. This loss and grief that comes from the fact that you no longer have what society considers a normal life. I don't even know what that means anymore. But because you don't fit into societal norms of what someone your age should be experiencing, it's a huge loss to process mentally. Because of that, emotions inevitably come up. I went through a period of time, this wasn't long ago, where I didn't know whether I would ever get back to even a sliver of what I had before I got sick. And with that came a grieving process, and eventually it led to acceptance of where I was. This took a lot of work, a lot of introspection, a lot of time, I would even say. And there was periods of times where the grieving process would repeat itself. And sometimes there still is. My preventative actually is doing really, really well right now. So I can actually do a lot. And it's actually gone past the point of realizing I really honestly didn't think I'd ever be able to do that again. I've said that to myself so much over the last couple of years in particular. And I don't say that to brag. I don't want people, concluding that everybody can get to this position, because not everybody can. You may not find a preventative that works, and you may not be able to tolerate the medication. Whatever the reason why the preventative doesn't work, it's not important for this conversation. The reality is not everybody finds medication that helps them. People don't necessarily ever find a medication that works for them, whatever the reason might be. And so they may not have the opportunity to be in this position. And so I want to make it very clear that I am extremely, extremely fortunate, and I would even say lucky at this point, to be in this position. I don't know whether I'm just used to the energy levels as well, or whether I'm so in tune with my body that I know when I'm pushing myself too far now, but I'm able to do quite a bit. And it's surprising to me as well, but it's great. That's exactly what I wanted with having a preventative, and it's worth every second of the amount of work it takes to earn it. Some people, they never find a combination of medications that work, so they're stuck in the chronic illness cycle or a chronic migraine cycle. They never go into remission with IIH, or they do and then they come out of remission and then they're stuck in the same thing. Nothing is guaranteed. So like with me right now, I'm taking every opportunity to enjoy what I'm able to, because there is always that voice in the back of my head, even still to this day, that says this is not guaranteed. Tomorrow being and feeling good is not guaranteed. You need to take every opportunity. And then when I do feel tired or not as feeling as good, example today, I'm exhausted. I did a workout yesterday after actually doing a 6-hour shift at work. Probably pushing it a little bit too far, but I kind of wanted to push my boundaries a little bit, because you get into the same routine and then you kind of don't realize where your boundaries are anymore. I am having to deal with a little bit of energetic restlessness as well. So there's that just buzzing energy that goes through me when I meditate. And I often meditate now whenever I have a spare moment. So to deal with that and manage that, I've been trying to exercise to try and wear myself out, essentially. It worked last night, it worked a little bit too well. And this morning, I woke up and I was like, oh boy, I don't feel well. And I actually thought I might be sleeping a little bit longer this morning. But then I got up, I did my meditation, and I actually felt pretty good. I'm fortunate for that. I am still a little achy and sore, of course, but it's a sign from my body now that it's time to slow down. That just comes with years of practice, basically. And forever you're stuck in that cycle of the cycle that I share so often on here about the overdoing it, having a good day, and then you overdo it and you're stuck again in the same spot. That cycle doesn't happen quite as much to me as what it used to. And a lot of it is that I know when I'm starting to feel tired. I know when it's time to break. You get to know what your limitations are over time. So don't rush this. I don't think it's right to tell people that if you're really, really stuck, that you're not trying hard enough. That being said, you do get to a point with this where it is start to become a time where you do need to kind of see where your limitations are. It requires pushing and sometimes accidentally overdoing it. That's kind of the only way you improve. And when it comes to exercise, it's really, really like that. So I think that's important to emphasize as well. A lot of us diagnosed with IIH and migraines and some of these other chronic illnesses are young. Imagine having your dreams of what you thought your adult life might look like immediately gone in an instant. Many of us are still trying to figure things out at these ages and may not know ourselves very well at all too. Basically, the loss with this of the dreams you thought you might have when you were younger. We've all been there, you know. What do you want to be when you grow up, or what are you interested in? All of that happens when you're kind of trying to find yourself in your 20s, and to be thrown essentially a curveball that says you're going to be dealing with a chronic illness and you're not going to have the opportunity to discover this is really hard. And actually, there are some people who get diagnosed with IIH in their late teens. It can be quite young, actually, that you're originally dealing with this. And I don't think it matters what age it happens. It's hard no matter what, but I think being diagnosed with a chronic illness when you're supposed to be in your prime according to society is particularly devastating. I don't know why this is, but although I'm female and actually quite comfortable with expressing emotions, crying is one that I tend to repress quite a bit around people I don't fully trust 100%. Some of this is conditioning, as I'm not always in an appropriate environment to express my emotions, at least not by consensus reality norms. Personally, I wish crying was treated differently in our society in North America. It's something that we are taught and is wrong in particular situations, and yet people are often inspired when someone shows such vulnerability. Crying is also extremely therapeutic, and the need to comfort others is strong. But what if we could just let people freely express what they're feeling in the moment? I could make a whole video about this, honestly. This emotional repression part of it with the crying, I think those of us who tend to look inward probably do this a lot by ourselves, so our family doesn't really realize that this is actually happening because we do a lot of this work not around them, so they're not going to see this. I think because of that inward tendency to process this on your own, people don't realize that it's a factor when it comes to dealing with these illnesses. It's not really well talked about, and I don't think it's really a common thing that is ever discussed. I wasn't ever, although I was given counseling on how to take medications properly, I was never taught about how to manage these emotions that come up with this process at all. That's one thing that's been nice actually about going through the shift in identity is I have people who can help walk through emotions and have tools on how to deal with that part of the process. But when it came to chronic illness, I didn't get that from anyone. I actually wonder if counseling should be a part of managing a chronic illness diagnosis, because there's nothing wrong with needing help to process very, very strong emotions. It's essentially a form of grief in a space that is safe with someone else who is willing to listen and provide the tools that is needed to get through this. I know for me, it's been a lot of inward processing mainly. There's a lot of emotional repression that comes along with this. And I think it's really, really important to emphasize that it's a major part, even though it's not something that probably really anyone sees with this process. I think that's everything that I came up with this particular subject. I hope you guys have learned something with this and have found it helpful in some way. If you have, please do subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you never miss any of my upcoming podcasts or videos. As you guys know, I'm across all social media, so I'm on TikTok and Threads and Instagram at Awareness with Ashley. You can also find me on Facebook at Ashley Stewart. For those of you who are listening to the podcast, you can find me on YouTube at Ashley Stewart. If you are listening on the podcast, please subscribe and leave a review, as it does help boost our podcast up and allow more people to hear and be made aware of what we're talking about with IIH and migraines. Thanks for joining me, and see you guys in 2024. Love you and stay safe this holiday season. I hope you all have a great time with family and friends. And for those of you who don't celebrate Christmas, I hope you have a great holiday season. I just want to thank you for your support during 2023 and wishing you a wonderful 2024. Love you guys.